The hidden history. When you think of a slave owner, who do you picture? Probably a wealthy white man, right? Maybe sitting on a plantation porch. That's the image in most history books. But here's what those books usually leave out. According to historical records, nearly 40% of slave owners in some southern states were women. White women weren't just bystanders watching slavery happen. They bought enslaved people. They sold them. They inherited them as wedding gifts. And in many documented cases, they were responsible for some of the most brutal treatment enslaved people endured. This isn't about blaming women more than men. This is about telling the complete truth about who participated in and profited from slavery. Because if we only tell half the story, we'll never fully understand how slavery worked or how its legacy still affects us today. American slavery lasted for over 240 years. That's not just a long time. That's 10 generations of people born, living, and dying in bondage. This system created massive wealth for white families, wealth that still influences economic inequality today. Enslaved people built the infrastructure of the South. They cleared land, constructed buildings, grew crops that made America rich, and every white family that owned enslaved people benefited. Not just the men, the women, the children. Everyone in those households lived off forced labor. But the role of white women has been deliberately minimized in popular history. We get stories about noble Southern belles who supposedly treated enslaved people kindly, about delicate women who fainted at the thought of violence. That image was propaganda, created after the Civil War to make slavery seem less brutal and to preserve white women's supposed innocence. The reality was very different. Here's the contradiction at the heart of white women's relationship with slavery. In many ways, white women had very little power in the 1800s. They couldn't vote. They couldn't serve on juries. When they married, their property legally belonged to their husbands under a system called coverture. In many states, a woman couldn't travel without male permission, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't even control her own children in a divorce. But here's where it gets complicated. While white women were restricted in these ways, they had one significant source of power and wealth: owning enslaved people. Parents gave daughters enslaved people as wedding gifts. Women inherited enslaved people from their families, and some women bought and sold enslaved people as independent business transactions. Slavery became tied to white women's identity and status. Having enslaved servants wasn't just about labor. It was about proving you were a respectable, wealthy, white woman. So while white women were oppressed by patriarchy, they often dealt with that oppression by oppressing others even more brutally. Let's talk about someone everyone knows: Martha Washington, America's First Lady. Most people know George Washington owned enslaved people. But here's what often gets left out. When George and Martha married, George owned 18 enslaved people. Martha brought 84 enslaved people to the marriage as part of her inheritance from her first husband. That's nearly 5 times as many. And during their marriage, the enslaved population at Mount Vernon grew to over 300 people. Martha managed the household enslaved workers directly. She decided their work assignments, controlled their food and clothing, and had the power to separate families by selling or giving away individuals. Historical records show she was particularly concerned with maintaining control and preventing escapes. When one enslaved person named Oni Judge escaped, Martha pursued her for years, trying to recapture her. This wasn't unusual. This was how elite white women operated. They weren't passive observers. They were active participants in slavery. White girls weren't born knowing how to be slave owners. They were trained from infancy. They watched their mothers give orders to enslaved people. They saw enslaved children their own age working while they played. They learned that black people existed to serve them. One documented case involves a 3-year-old girl named Lizzie Anna Burwell. According to historical accounts, she demanded that her father cut off the ears of an enslaved servant who displeased her. Her father, instead of correcting this cruelty, rewarded her by giving her more enslaved people as property. This wasn't a one-time story. Historians have documented numerous cases of white children being encouraged to exercise power over enslaved people as part of their upbringing. Girls learned to view enslaved people not as human beings, but as tools, as property, as extensions of their own will. By the time these girls became women, managing enslaved people seemed completely normal. It was just part of being a proper white lady. Now here's what I want to know from you. How do you think this kind of childhood training affected these women's ability to see enslaved people as human? Can someone raised in a system like this even recognize its cruelty? Drop a comment because this raises questions about how we're all shaped by the systems we grow up in. Now you might be thinking, wait, didn't you say married women couldn't own property? So, how did they own enslaved people? Good question. Technically, under coverture laws, a married woman's property belonged to her husband, but families found creative ways around this. Wealthy Southern families created prenuptial agreements, trusts, and special deeds that kept enslaved people as the woman's separate property, even after marriage. Why did they bother with this complicated legal maneuvering? Because enslaved people were valuable assets. Families wanted to make sure daughters could maintain their wealth and status independent of their husbands. Court records show hundreds of cases where women successfully argued in court that specific enslaved people belonged to them personally, not to their husbands. This tells us something important. White women weren't just passive recipients of slavery's benefits. They actively fought to maintain their ownership of human beings. They used the legal system to protect their ability to own people. That's not accidental. That's deliberate. White women didn't just inherit enslaved people. They bought and sold them as active participants in the domestic slave trade. Historical records show women advertising enslaved people for sale in newspapers, negotiating prices, and conducting sales independently. Some women operated their own businesses buying and selling enslaved people. They weren't unusual. They were part of the normal economic system. But the economic aspect was just one part. There was also the intimate, daily violence of slave ownership. White women had direct, constant contact with enslaved people who worked in their homes. They controlled every aspect of these workers' lives. Historical accounts document white women beating enslaved workers, burning them with hot irons, starving them as punishment, and separating children from parents. One particularly disturbing practice involved forcing enslaved women into reproductive slavery. White women would force enslaved women to have children specifically to increase their property. They would also separate mothers from infants, to use the mothers as wet nurses for white children. An enslaved woman named Henrietta Butler was documented as being forced to nurse her mistress's child, while her own baby was taken away. These weren't rare occurrences. These were common practices, orchestrated and enforced by white women. The image of the kind mistress who treated enslaved people like family, that was mostly propaganda. When enslaved people themselves wrote about their experiences after gaining freedom, they often described white women as being particularly cruel. You might think white women would have accepted emancipation when it came, but many fought it with everything they had. As Union troops approached, some white women refugeed their enslaved workers. They moved them further south or to Texas to keep them away from Union lines. After the war, white women demanded compensation from the government for their lost property, meaning the human beings they'd been forced to free. They also found new ways to maintain control. The apprenticeship system allowed white families to essentially re-enslave black children by claiming they needed to train them. White women would go to courts and claim that freed black children needed their guidance, and courts would force these children into unpaid labor until they turned 21. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about this period. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery. White women were part of that movement back toward bondage. They adapted to the legal end of slavery by creating new forms of exploitation. Slavery didn't end, it transformed, and white women were active participants in the new system. The black codes and convict leasing system essentially created slavery by another name. Black people could be arrested for minor offenses or simply for being unemployed, then leased out as prison labor. White women profited from this system. Rebecca Latimer Felton, who would become the first woman U.S. Senator, wrote approvingly in her memoir about harsh sentences for black defendants. She described cases where black teenagers received 5 to 10-year sentences for stealing pocket change, and she celebrated this as justice. A 15-year-old black girl in Atlanta was sentenced to 5 years for taking 50 cents. Judges who sent black people into convict leasing systems often had financial interests in the companies that used that forced labor. And white women who owned businesses or had investments profited right alongside them. When you think of the Ku Klux Klan, you probably picture men in white robes. But by the 1920s, the KKK had a massive women's auxiliary. The women of the Ku Klux Klan, or WKKK, had between 250,000 and 500,000 members at its peak. These weren't women just supporting their husband's racism. They had their own organizational structure, their own leadership, their own activities. They organized boycotts of Catholic and Jewish businesses. They pressured school boards to fire Catholic teachers. They held parades and public rallies. Leaders like Lulu Markwell in Arkansas and Daisy Douglas Barr in Indiana were prominent figures. Barr was both a Pentecostal preacher and a KKK leader. They used their social networks, church groups, women's clubs, parent organizations, to spread white supremacist ideology. And they did it all while presenting themselves as respectable Christian women protecting their families and communities. This is important to understand. White supremacy wasn't just enforced by violent men. It was also enforced through social networks dominated by women. What do you think about the role of social pressure and community networks in maintaining racism? Because we still see this today. Racism that operates through whispers, exclusion, and social control rather than violence. Is that kind of racism less harmful? Or is it actually more insidious because it's harder to challenge? Let me know in the comments. So what's the pattern we're seeing across all these different time periods? White women benefited from slavery and its aftermath. They actively participated in maintaining racial hierarchy. They used their social power to enforce white supremacy. And crucially, they often escaped historical accountability because of the myth of white female innocence. The idea of the delicate, moral, innocent white woman was used to justify everything from slavery to lynching to Jim Crow. White women were supposedly so pure that they needed protection, even if that protection meant brutalizing black people. This myth still operates today. When we talk about racism, we often focus on white men while giving white women a pass. We act like white women were just along for the ride, when in fact, they were often driving. Let's be clear about what this video is and isn't saying. This isn't about claiming white women were worse than white men. Both participated in slavery. Both profited. Both were responsible. This is about telling the complete story, about acknowledging that slavery and racism weren't just male endeavors. White women bought and sold human beings. They beat, starved, and tortured enslaved people. They separated families. They profited from forced labor. They resisted emancipation. They helped create and maintain Jim Crow. They led white supremacist organizations. These are historical facts, documented in legal records, diaries, newspapers, court cases, and testimonies from enslaved people themselves. Why does this matter today? Because we can't dismantle racism if we don't understand how it was built. And we can't understand how it was built if we only look at half the people who built it. The legacy of slavery still shapes wealth inequality, housing discrimination, educational disparities, and criminal justice outcomes in America. Understanding white women's role in creating and maintaining that system is part of understanding how to finally dismantle it. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here and what we need to change to create a more just future. If this video made you think differently about American history, let me know in the comments. And if you want more videos exploring the untold parts of history, hit subscribe.